For our special discussion of the day, a World Economic Forum study shows that it's getting harder to be a woman in 2017. India ranks at a dismal 108 out of 144 nations. Shireen joins in now with a special panel of guests. Shireen, over to you.
100 long years, that is the time the world needs to bridge the gender gap that currently exists. This is the shocking finding of the latest global survey by the World Economic Forum. Remember, they've been doing this since 2006. And this is just one of the many headlines that we have found in that survey. Let's take a look at the other big one. It will take a whopping 217 years to bridge the economic gap between men and women. 217 years. It will take 99 years to end the disparity in the area of politics. But there is one area where we have seen a massive improvement, and that is education. The survey highlights that there the gap can be closed in just 13 years. Here are some of the other headlines from the gender survey. The progress that's been made for 10 straight years has been stalled in 2017, and that is the disappointing global headline. Here's where India ranks. We are now ranked 108 among 144 nations. We have slipped, and we have slipped significantly. Our ranking has dropped 21 places on the World Economic Forum survey. Neighbors like China and Bangladesh fare better than India in the rankings. India is also the least improved nation on a parameter that measures health and survival for women. We are ranked a dismal 141 out of 144 countries there. But there is a silver lining. For 2 straight years, India is the #1 country when it comes to the enrollment of girls in both primary as well as secondary education. So once again, at #1 there. There's plenty more to discuss and debate. And joining me today are 2 former bureaucrats, Sudha Pillai and Sujatha Rao. Also with us, a veteran of the financial services industry, broken the glass ceiling, Naina Lal Kidwai, Apurva Purihot, author and director at Radio City, Urvashi, founder of Study Hall Education Foundation, as well as the winner of this year's Social Entrepreneur of the Year Award, which is a partnership of World Economic Forum and the Schwab Foundation. Sairee Chahal, founder at Sheroes. Power women here to discuss and debate the disappointing headlines that we have to contend with. Ladies, thanks very much for joining us on the program. Before I come to you, let me go across to my colleague Ritu Singh, who's been poring over the data, and she breaks up India's performance on some other key parameters. Ritu.
Shireen, the performance is dismal on most parameters except for primary and secondary education that you mentioned. So let me start with the participation of women in the economy, where we're ranked 139 out of 144 countries. Again, falling 4 places from a position last year. But on wage equality, we've made some improvement at the 80th position in this year's ranking. On women participating in the labor force, India again ranks a dismal 136 out of 144 countries. This is another area where we have again slipped from last year. But we have been doing consistently well when it comes to political empowerment of women. This year, we are ranked at #15. This is still 6 places lower than where we started last year, which was at the 9th position. On health and life expectancy, the ranking is quite poor. In fact, we're at 141 out of the total 144 nations. And on life expectancy, we've dropped 46 places to come at 117th position. Let me move on to the area of education, where again, there's dismal rankings when it comes to the literacy rate. But there is a minor improvement if you look at the tertiary education of women, where we ranked 95. There is some improvement for last year. And finally, the place of pride for India, we're the toppers when it comes to the enrollment of women in the primary and secondary education, #1 on both the spots for the last 2 years. With that, this sort of sums up how India fared. With that, it's back to you.
All right, thanks very much, Ritu, for that. Let me now get started with our panelists. And Sujatha Rao, I want to come to you first and pick up on what is really the big disappointment across the many headlines that we've just put forward for our viewers. India remains the world's least improved country in the health and survival sub-index in the past 10 years. Let's take a look at our health life expectancy. We rank at 117 out of 144. What seems to have gone wrong here, Sujatha Rao? You're somebody who understands the healthcare sector. You've been involved with policy making at the highest level. What has gone wrong here?
Well, life expectancy is very heavily contributed by the rate of neonatal mortality. So it makes a huge difference if the child is able to survive beyond the first 1 month after birth. that is what makes for the life expectancy indices also. And we still continue to have almost 2/3 of our infant mortality on account of early deaths. And, you know, we are not investing enough, basically, on the related issues of nutrition, safe water, which is the main reasons why such neonatal mortality is taking place. And if you notice, Shireen, India is the only country in the world, I think, where female deaths under 5, the age group of under 5 females is higher than the males. Normally, it is the boys who die more numbers than the girls under 5 child mortality, but in India it's the reverse.
We've gone from what has been the biggest disappointment as far as the India story is concerned to now let me move to the silver lining, the area where we've actually done well. We've come in at #1 on the area of enrolling girls in both primary as well as secondary education. The story is very different when it comes to tertiary education, where we rank 95 on the index. Urvashi, Sahni, you've spent your career educating girls, trying to get girls to school. So clearly something that both the private sector as well as the government has done has been working, and it's been working consistently over the years. But how do you explain then the drop between primary, secondary and tertiary education?
Thank you, Shireen. You know, before I do that, I just want to refer back to the other two speakers and say that the one thing that we should remember, and the reason for the poor performance in health, and people mentioned child marriage, people mentioned feticide and infanticide, it's because girls aren't valued enough. That is a really important thing that we need to focus on. And gender discrimination carries on rampantly. In terms of why they're doing well in primary and secondary and not in tertiary is that, of course, early marriages are very important, and dropout. You know, enrollment is not a good parameter of educational success. More importantly, we should be looking at completion rates, we should be looking at dropout rates, and then, of course, transition.
Let me take that point across to Naina Lal Kidwai. Naina, you know, you broke the glass ceiling several decades ago, and look at the story that we're still dealing with. When we talk about economic leadership, whether the law mandates equal pay for men and women in India, no. Advancement of women to leadership roles, about 64%. Women on boards of publicly traded companies, 13%, firms with female co-owners, 12%, firms with female top managers, 10%. And we have a problem, as Apurva was just pointing out, of being able to retain female talent. And that shows up in our overall workforce participation number.
Shireen, clearly the numbers are very disappointing because, you know, some anecdotal data suggests, as indeed in the financial services sector, that we're doing really well. More CMDs, CEOs of banks than we have anywhere else in the world in terms of percentages at the top. But there is clearly a huge missing gap in between, which needs to be worked on. I just want to lend a slightly different color to this discussion on the economic participation bit, because there is some data which probably needs further analysis. And I've heard said among some experts that it is possible that what is happening is women who were earlier, for example, in jobs like construction work, etc., have, because of moving up in terms of poverty indices and improved lives, are actually moving out of spaces which they now don't need to work in because they are doing better as a family. And if that's indeed the case, that the economic participation quality has changed in a way that women don't have to do menial work which they were earlier having to do.
Mazumdar-Shaw, let me come to you, because as Naina was pointing out, one, of course, is the social baggage, and this has persisted, you know, year after year, decade after decade, and it continues even in 2017. That's the story, that is the reality. The other is the economic benefit of the woman being employed in the workforce, and whether that adds up to everything that she manages to do at home. But, you know, let's look at comparisons with our neighbors. Even Bangladesh is ranked significantly higher than India at 47. So Kiran, from a policy perspective, what do you believe is the need of the hour? We've seen the maternity bill being passed by Parliament, and there are both sides of the debate. One side that believes that this will in fact worsen the situation of having women in the workforce. The other believes that this will maybe improve that. But what, from a policy perspective, is now the need of the hour?
So I completely agree with your observation and comment, Shireen, that we have a country like Bangladesh where women are included in the economic development index much more than what is happening in India. And I think that is something that we have to learn from. I think there is a huge need, and I'm glad that we're really focusing on the girl child in terms of education. I'm glad we are talking about maternal health, and I'm glad we are really focusing on women empowerment in every way. You know, and economic empowerment is extremely crucial to raising women's status in society. So I think we really need to look at policies that encourage and incentivize women in the workplace. Yeah. And I think if you look at even in the formal sector, I mean, when I look at the representation of women in business, in the corporate world itself, I think we are very underrepresented. Yes. And, you know, I think there are many companies, including ours, where we are really taking policy decisions to encourage women in leadership roles. Yes. Because, you know, things like, you know, almost, you know, judging, you know, measuring people's performance by saying, what is the diversity index in your division or your department is a very good way of actually incentivizing people. So I personally believe, yes, we do need to focus on policy measures, policy decisions to empower women in not just the informal workplace, but in the formal workplace as well.
So Kiran, let me ask you to give us two ideas that you would like to leave us with, both that the corporate sector could and the private sector could on its own take forward, and what you expect by way of intervention from the government.
So I think the corporate world really needs to take a lot of initiatives in gender diversity policies, and I really believe that there needs to be a you know, incentives provided for male managers to make sure that they have women reportees. In fact, there are already companies that are looking at saying that, you know, every manager, whether you're male or female, you should have at least 20% reportees who are women. Right. These kind of policies are being taken by companies. So that's at a corporate level. You know, at a government level, at a policy level, I think we are looking at mandating certain things, you know, board representation of women. Yeah. Right? That is one such measure that people have taken. But I think we need to also look at leadership as a very important focus area, because I find what happens is that women actually enter the corporate world at the lower rungs, but they basically start, you know, becoming very thin when they come to the top. Yes. And I think they sort of almost sort of step off at some stage for various reasons, and that's where we really need to make sure that we allow people to, you know, take time off. Already, you know, we've introduced very important maternity leave measures and things like that. Now, that should actually encourage women to actually look at, you know, these formal jobs much more seriously than before. Okay, because otherwise, that was something that was a disincentive for women. For women, yeah. Even from a family point of view.
We've also got Sudha Pillai, former bureaucrat who worked in the Planning Commission. Sudha Pillai, you know, let's look at the four parameters. Economic participation, 139 out of 144. Education, 112 out of 144. Health and survival, as I pointed out, the worst headline, 141 out of 144. Political empowerment, and this is the good news, 15 out of 144. So we're getting the politics of it right in a sense. But Sudha Pillai, policy imperatives to ensure that we move up these rankings.
Shireen, let me start with political empowerment. And I think political empowerment we seem to have done very well in the index, only because we have reservation at the panchayat level and at the urban local government level for women. We're not less than 1/3 to begin with, and now almost 50% of the elected people are women. But I think in terms of their actual empowerment, some more work needs to be done. That's number one. None of the NGOs ever talk or ever, you know, involve panchayat women in actually permitting them to hold teachers and doctors to become accountable. And I think this is a very important factor.
Yeah.
Our parliament does not show too many women, actually. I think that's still a problem. In terms of health, I think very serious attitudes which are linked to poor education, poor social folkways and mores, all these actually impede women's access to healthcare. Even where there is healthcare, I've seen that Kerala is an exception only because of social attitudes. But in states which are financially well off, but attitudinally women are not valued, I think they do not see the doctors. They don't see the doctors till it's very late.
Yeah.
And I think there has to be a linkage between health and education.
Sairee, we need to include men into the conversation. But, you know, you've spent the last several years trying to look at ways an out-of-the-box solution of getting women to get back to the workplace if they had opted out because of maternity or marriage or any of those other reasons. What is the experience on the ground, Sairee? And what do you believe is the need of the hour? Do we, do this through the legislative route? How do we ensure that this reality changes, Sairee?
Right. So I think, our reality refuses to change because there are many stark issues at hand, but one of which is that this needs a multi-pronged approach. This is not something that only government or only civil society or only companies can look at individually and change. At heart, the fundamental question around women's safety, their, the priority of, us as a society, as a nation, as a government, in terms of making sure that we put this on our nation-building priority. And I think we really need to go down that route because this is something that impacts many other, aspects, right from GDP creation to, financial contribution of women.
You're absolutely right. There is an economic benefit of including women in the workforce. But Sairee, ideas now that we need to implement, execute. Let's talk about that.
So I think three major ideas here. One is more investment in education and healthcare, because without that, you really can't have a welfare state. Fundamental focus in more education, more healthcare, and thirdly, more creation on micro-entrepreneurship, because we know the future of work is not in jobs, and women are the worst impacted segment because jobs are not growing, and women's participation in the workforce is also not growing because of that. It's a very significant issue, and we have to take more efforts, make more efforts to make sure women become either self-employed or they become entrepreneurs or they become job creators instead of job seekers.
Right.
Because this is a very stark situation. The job needle hasn't moved in this country in the last couple of years. We've only been slashing jobs, and the women are the worst affected in this case.
You're absolutely right. So, Sujatha Rao, let me come back to you now. I need from each one of you three ideas that we need to focus on. It needs to become part of our national discourse, whether it's the center or the state or the media. We need to ensure that these ideas are taken forward. Your time starts now, Sujatha Rao.
Well, I have, since you're looking for ideas, and very quickly I have 4 suggestions to make. And one is that, let's triangulate the data from all the different components that you've been discussing. And, of course, we've made a huge advance in terms of having more women in the boards and all that. But much of it is still symbolic if you take a macro view of the number of women and what their status today is. And I think, what worries me about women is the increasing vulnerability. 93% of them are informal sector. They earn 30% lesser wages, whether formal or informal, than the men. We don't have a law to say equal wages shall be paid. So it's a very exploitative environment, and that needs to be addressed, number one. Number two is, as long as you have girls dropouts at primary and then going up to tertiary, much fewer girls getting into that stream, that's where the talent really comes out. And that's where the integration with the economy takes place. And so there has to be much more of indices to say how many girls are getting into the formal employment. and which is also then related to skill development and a better status of women. And I think much more money needs to be put in and focus on that. And the second is, you know, there was some concept in the policy making, and Sudha should tell us about gender budgeting. And I believe that if that is taken up seriously, and there is an earmarking, I mean, you know, I don't mean that you have to earmark 20% and do that, but the focus then shifts to say a skill development ministry, how many girls are really being skilled, how many women are being, you know, so there has to be that kind of gender budgeting, which we need to take it in the real serious terms, not on a, and my last point is, you know, I'm really worried about the increasing vulnerability, stress levels, depressions and mental health among women is much higher because of all these external factors. And I think there has to be a lot more of life skill education right from schools, where girls and boys need to know and respect each other. The boys have to be, there has to be a gendering process all through, both from schools upwards. So these are my four suggestions I have right now. Overall, of course,
those are great suggestions.
Social sector spending, Shireen, has to go up.
Yes.
Sorry.
Has to go up. Sudha Pillai, gender budgeting, gender responsive funding, you know, linked to outcomes, and it is finally a circle, whether it's education or healthcare. All of this needs to be aligned to come together to ensure that we improve the quality of women, the lives of women in this country.
Shireen, I'd rather answer to your point that I want to make three recommendations. Gender budgeting actually remains on paper. I've seen that happen. I feel that unless women are politically powerful, and for that I think in our parliament somewhere along the line we have to have at least 30 to 40% women representatives. That's number one for me. Number
so you think women's reservation has to be pushed
I don't know about reservation, but somewhere along the line we have to move in the direction of 30 to 40% representation of women in the parliament. Number two, every quarter.
I want to get
every quarter. Every
on this issue of whether making it mandatory or not, there was a lot of resistance even on making this board representation mandatory. But the fact of the matter is that if we haven't seen significant improvement or any improvement on several of these parameters, has the time now come for the government to legislate and make it mandatory to see an improvement, Sudha Pillai?
I think so. I'm sorry, I think so. Because it won't happen otherwise.
Okay.
Number two, every quarter.
It won't happen otherwise.
Every quarter, a company should have the HRD manager come in and tell how, in terms of the attrition, how many women have actually left. What are the arrangements for childcare? What are the arrangements that they have for permitting women to actually move up the career graph? And I think this is not happening. There are focus on financial results, focus on, you know, strategy, etc., risk, everything, but none on personnel management and how women are faring in a company. And the third recommendation I would make is that government should double, if not triple, its health budget straight away. Because it's actually done that for education,
this has been a long-standing demand.
Has gone up. And enrollment has gone up. And an educated woman, I've seen it in the emergency rooms or major hospitals, that uneducated women whose faces are covered up to their waistlines bring in babies who are dead actually for treatment to the emergency rooms because they have not been watching for symptoms of disease.
Higher investment, significantly higher investment in healthcare. Urvashi, Sahni, three ideas from you.
Yes. First one is a very concerted effort on almost a campaign mode to change social attitudes, and with education to plant gender studies in the official curriculum so that both boys and girls right from day one learn to think equally and learn to change the gendered roles that we have. So I think that in teacher training, in curriculum, in pedagogical practices, you need to have gender studies as a real serious focus, not as a peripheral life skills on the center after school program, but as a serious part of the official curriculum because women are dying. That I think is the main idea. Then to have strict punitive measures against things like child marriages. That we take it, there's a law, but it's not enforced carefully. Nobody knows about it.
Enforced,
then, a very strong very strong campaign on literacy, about, or, you know, on informing people about girls' rights, about laws that exist. You'll be amazed how nobody is aware of all the laws and the provisions in the law for women. These should be part of education. They should also be part of very large-scale social campaigns.
You're right.
Think of it. If we could increase our enrollment by enrollment campaigns, we can certainly use the same campaign mode to bring about a change in social attitudes, because at root, that is the main
Absolutely
culprit.
right. And that logic should,
Sudha Pillai's idea on the 33% reservation.
Women's
Definitely
reservation.
we need that legislation, and soon.
Okay.
In Parliament.
Apurva, quick idea from you.
You know, when we talk about reservations at the top, we are approaching it wrong. We are looking at the top of the pyramid, where actually the problem is the leaky pipeline, where after 3 or 4 years of working, women leave. That's where I think handholding needs to be done by the organization, by policies, etc., to ensure that at the stage when women are going through the childbearing phase, they need to be handheld so that they don't leave their jobs. And the second bit is this whole aspect of the economic benefit diversity brings to the table. I think that education is very importantly needed to be done, that 60% improvement in a company's profitability or in the GDP of a country can happen when women are part of the workforce. That education needs to be driven home to leaders.
All right, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, I'll give you the final say on this. The one big idea that you would like everyone, government, media, private sector, to work on to take this forward.
So, you know, this year's Nobel Prize was won by a behavioral economist who was famous for the nudge theory. And I really believe that we have to basically get corporations, companies, state governments to really, you know, lead by example and nudge others to follow good practices. I think you have to show better performance, better economic development through all what the panelists have talked about. And I think that's the kind of policy that we need. We need to nudge people into believing that better gender representation means better politics, better economics, better education, better healthcare. I think that's the way we have to go about these policies.
Well, nudge as well as crack the whip where it is necessary. Ladies, thanks very much for joining us on the CNBC TV 18 special as we discuss the disappointing reality that we're faced with, but we do hope that some of the ideas that you've put forward will at least encourage people, corporations, governments to start thinking and taking this issue seriously. Sujatha Rao, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, Sudha Pillai, Naina Lal Kidwai, Sairee Chahal, Apurva Purihot and Urvashi, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18.